We're going to continue our discussion about challenges facing the United States with another group of Brookings experts. So I would like to welcome Makeda Henry-Nicky, who's the David Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies. John Villant is a Fellow in Governance Studies in our Brown Center on Educational Policy. Margaret Taylor is a Fellow in Governance Studies and Senior Editor and Counsel at Lawfare. And Mike Hansen is a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Director of the Brown Center on Education Policy. So I want to start with Makeda. So you came to us from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and have worked on ways to protect consumers. What do you see as the biggest challenges for consumers in the financial area, and how should we protect them?
So I think there are two main challenges that we need to keep our eye on. And the first, I think, comes from this general repeal of responsible regulation to protect consumers. And I think Director Mulvaney, Acting Director Mulvaney, who previously led the Bureau, removed considerable protections across a number of important sort of key markets, whether it's student loan protections that he walked back, mortgage reporting callbacks, payday lending. So across all fronts, there's been a massive just sort of pull the carpet from under the feet of consumers that we need to correct immediately. But I do think that in correcting and righting that ship, there's an opportunity here to think more clearly about what systems we replace with what Director Mulvaney took down. So, for example, I think with the widespread use of machine learning is really going to present some key challenges for us. I see that more and more, whether it's fintechs or Facebook or Google, there's a blurring of the lines between, for example, marketing, how we encourage consumers to reach out and join the financial services market, and then how do those interactions with financial services institutions, non-bank and bank, translate to credit rationing processes. So there's a new study out from the University of California, Berkeley that showed that even with fintech and all these brand new algorithmic decision scoring models, there's still a fair amount of pricing discrimination in the market. And African Americans and Latinos continue to bear the brunt of this cost imbalance. Between 5.6 and 8.6 basis points higher, they're charged than their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And that's hundreds of millions of dollars in the pockets of financial institutions, and that's sort of extracted from these consumers who tend to be the most vulnerable. However, what they did find, I think that was most interesting, is that lending discrimination when it comes to who gets loans and who gets approved versus denied, it declines significantly. And I think that's a bright spot. But I wonder what's the true source of that bright spot. Is it because in the marketing space, companies can now target who they want to encourage applications from, and so the denominator looks artificially, smaller, and therefore the origination disparities don't look too concerning. There's a lot of, I think, blurring, and that we need to sort of really disentangle what's going on. I'm just going to add one last thing. I think we need to sort of think about how FTC and CFPB really connect and sort of come closer together in how they protect consumers. There's this big gulf between these two agencies, and between data challenges, whether it's cookies that are tracking you all over the internet, that provide a wealth of information for companies to turn into lead generators. CFPB doesn't have a lot of jurisdiction in that area, so we really need to bring these two agencies together, borrow some stuff from the GDPR in Europe to really put our consumer protection framework back together.
Okay, John, we know there are many challenges in K-12 education, so what do you see as the primary problems there, and what can we do to address them?
Sure, so thinking about sort of challenges and opportunities and risks in K-12 education, I think it's useful to step back and remember that our public schools are the institutions that we have and we use to prepare Americans for adult life. So that's preparing workers to be contributing members of the economy. It's preparing citizens to participate constructively in American democracy. And so when we heard in the last panel, Elaine talking about the importance of having a sophisticated citizenry to sort of process the political messages that are out there, schools aren't going to be the ones to sort of prepare people to handle deep fakes in a really sort of quick, immediate fashion, but they are the institutions we have to sort of build a foundation so that people are equipped to handle that kind of thing. And we have some problems in schools today. So one, which is not new, is that we have very large gaps in the opportunities and outcomes for children of different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So for one statistic to illustrate that, if you were to look at 8th grade test scores in math, in reading, in civics, and you took the median score for African American students, it would fall between the 10th and 25th percentile in the distribution of scores for white students. That's a really big gap, and that's a gap that then is going to have implications far down the road. A second issue, in my view, is that we still have education policy and practice in schools that is very much guided by No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind was federal education legislation that came out of the George W. Bush administration, and really what it did is it put a lot of emphasis on testing core academic subjects, especially math and English, and schools really reorganized a whole lot of their decision-making around how do we get our test scores up in those subjects. That has produced a narrowing of how we think about the purposes of schools that I think is historically anomalous and has real consequences for sort of how our students are prepared. So some kind of opportunities and risks down the road. Three sort of big picture ideas here. So I think one is that we need to think in education about policies that are not fundamentally education policies that really have big impacts on students' K-12 experiences. So there's a group that, as a couple of examples here, there's a group that just released a report called A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty that looks at how we have 10 million students living below the poverty line. And this group, and Ron Haskins here at Brookings and many other people are involved in this group, they looked at different packages of policy reforms, most of which are outside of education, to see can we cut that number of kids who are living in poverty when we know that that would have impacts on their performance in school. And if you start looking at potential approaches like expanding access to the federal earned income tax credit, there's a lot that you can do outside of schools that's going to touch students and families in ways that would sort of help their opportunities in school. Another example on housing policy is we have persistent segregation in schools and we have problems of access to high-performing schools for disadvantaged communities. We have a Fair Housing Act. What the Fair Housing Act does not prevent is it doesn't prevent exclusionary zoning policies that will prevent apartments from being built and multifamily housing units in places that are expensive to live, where that is the only way that low-income and middle-income families could possibly access those communities. So there is this sort of bucket of non-education policies, and really I think in education we should be thinking that housing policy is education policy, and tax policy is education policy, and we need to think sort of outside of just what education policy is. A second piece is I think schools need to take much more seriously their responsibilities to preparing students for democratic life. So we have, in this sort of world in which it's No Child Left Behind and core academic skills that drives a lot of decision making, that is what students are learning right now. And if you look back through the history of American schools, there's a lot in that history that's not very good, but it has been the case that schools historically have been pretty responsive to what we perceive to be the needs of the time. So when we had a lot of immigrants coming in and there was concern about assimilating immigrants, that was sort of borne out in the way that schools approach things. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in the 1950s, Congress put money into science and math and foreign language education. In my view, if you look at what the core challenge in the country is today, it's not related to how well kids know math. It's not related to their English abilities. It's a democratic issue. And in focusing as strongly as we have on these core academic subjects in No Child Left Behind, we've left a lot of skill building and knowledge generation just totally off the table. That makes me very nervous about where we are. And I'd say too on that, and we can get more into that in a bit, I think there are skills for participating in American democracy today that need to be taught in ways that maybe you could sort of trust parents to teach skills in the past. And then a sort of third and final thought on this, and this is sort of a place where I think there's a lot of activity right now on the K-12 side. Charter schools. So charter schools are publicly funded, privately run schools that are drawing a lot of attention these days from Democratic candidates. And a big reason for that is that the politics are shifting pretty quickly. So we're seeing less support from Democrats than we have in the past, particularly less support from white Democrats than we have in the past. And there's a good chance that there's going to be some movement, maybe not so much at the federal level, but there will be some movement on charters. And there are a lot of problems to clean up with charter schools, for sure. They also, in many ways, serve important roles, especially in a lot of urban school systems. And we're going to need to make sure that if we go and sort of take another look at charter school policy, that it's done in a delicate way that doesn't inflict harm on the communities that need those kinds of opportunities the most.
Okay, thank you. So Margaret, I know you've been looking at ways to stem foreign interference in U.S. elections. So how can we secure our 2020 elections?
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. The last panel actually spoke quite a bit about this topic, so I probably should have been on the last panel, I don't know. But so I'll try not to be repetitive with what was discussed, but it is interesting that a number of us scholars here sort of came up with that topic as an interesting thing to be looking at. So, you know, obviously on lawfare, we have been following the Mueller report very closely. Part one of the Mueller report really lays out, really in black and white, what Russian interference looked like in the 2016 election. We'd heard about it before from the intelligence community, from the various indictments that Mueller had brought against, for example, the Internet Research Agency. But I do think the Mueller report really just laid it out in black and white. You know, you read it and you understand kind of what Russia was doing in 2016. So I think we're at a stage where there's not a whole lot of lack of knowledge about the various things that are going on in terms of foreign interference in U.S. elections. I do agree with with Elaine from the last panel that it's not a new thing. I think this type of interference has taken on different forms over time, but it is not new. It was something that would have been familiar to our founding fathers, maybe not so much exactly with elections, but with the democracy in general. That is what actually spurred the insertion into our Constitution of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, because our founding fathers were worried about foreign interference in our democracy. Basically, they would have been very familiar with this. I do think we as Americans have been maybe a little bit more naive about what's going on in terms of foreign interference, and I do think the 2016 election has brought these issues to the fore, and I think that's a good thing. So what I was sort of interested in is, there's lots of countries out there around the world have been dealing with, in particular, Russian interference, but interference from foreign adversaries for much longer, than we have in the recent past. It's been much more in the forefront of how they manage their elections and their democracy. I'm only going to focus on three aspects of this very, very quickly. There's lots of facets to the problem. I think it's, sort of a whole of society, not even a whole of government, but a whole of society sort of issue. And that's how actually a number of countries around the world face this problem. So I'm just going to very quickly. The first is election infrastructure. So there's a little line in the Mueller report that basically says that Russia was in a position. The FBI believes the GRU, which is the Russian intelligence unit, there was an opportunity to gain access to the network of at least one Florida county government. And then Marco Rubio is also sort of has said, he's reinforced this. It said that Russian hackers accessed a Florida voting system and were in a position to change voter roll data. So this is a real thing. The question, I think, is what is our government doing about it right now? I do think there are efforts, particularly in the Department of Homeland Security. They're honest and forthright efforts to get this right. There was a February 2019 DHS Inspector General, so the Inspector General is looking at what DHS is doing on this issue. The report is a good report. I can't say it inspires much confidence, and I'm just going to read a little section of it, just so then I'll tell you what I think the real problem is and challenge going forward on election infrastructure. So part of this report said, without updating the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which is a DHS report, DHS may not have identified all threats and vulnerabilities associated with the election infrastructure subsector and areas for mitigating potential risks. So what that tells me is, one problem is we have not fully diagnosed what the problem is in terms of our election infrastructure. So there is more work to be done on that, for sure. I think that is just very, very key. Our federal system makes this a big, diverse project, and it can be tackled, and I think really addressed in a meaningful way, but we have to understand all of the avenues of vulnerability. So that's number one. Number two, social media. This was addressed in the last panel with some detail, so I won't go into it, but I will just say, in looking at this, where I've also landed, along with the former panelists, is this notion of media literacy and digital competence. We have a First Amendment. We love our First Amendment. It presents lots of challenges to how we're going to deal with this particular issue, which is why I think a number of us probably have landed on this idea of media literacy and digital competence. And I'm going to leave that to my colleagues to figure out how to operationalize that in the education system. I will just say, in my own family, I have a daughter who is in private school, and she's in the 8th grade. She's already had a class on digital competence and media literacy, meaning teaching kids how to identify fake news, teaching kids how to understand a website, understand where it's coming from, what biases it might have. Very interesting, very effective, I think. She's 14 and she's already pretty sophisticated on it. My son, who's in public school, has not had this type of training yet. I'm hoping that he will at some point, but it's not a part of the curriculum right now. I also will just say, in my own family, I have older, my mother-in-law and my parents, they are, that block of voters who are that age, 65 to 80, basically, they vote in huge, huge numbers. And my personal view is that that generation is also very vulnerable, not having sort of grown up in the sort of media environment that my daughter has grown up in, very vulnerable to manipulation on the internet, conspiracy theories, et cetera. In my own family, I see my 14-year-old actually helping my mother-in-law to understand news sources that she's reading online. So I do think that the older generation can't be ignored when it comes to media literacy and digital competence. Okay, so that's the second piece. Oh, one more thing. Sweden has been addressing this media literacy issue for years. The Nordic states, I think, are the gold standard in terms of really helping their citizenry be sophisticated. And so, for example, they have a very popular cartoon character called Bamsi the Bear. That the government basically said, okay, well, you have Bamsi the Bear do some bits on cartoons to help children learn about the dangers of fake news. So we can learn from other countries who have been doing this for a longer period of time and are more sophisticated. Finally, this is my last thing. The norm itself. All of you are here. You're here at a governance studies presentation. I'm assuming all of you probably agree that foreign interference in our elections and in our democracy is a bad thing. I'm not totally convinced that all Americans necessarily think that way. And we see voices in our government not reinforcing the norm that foreign interference is bad. So, for example, probably all of you saw in an interview with Axios last week, I believe it was, or maybe 10 days ago, Jared Kushner was asked, if the Russians sort of emailed you in and said, hey, let's get together in Trump Tower and talk about your political foes, would you do it? And he basically, would you call the FBI? He's like, well, no, I don't think so. I don't know what I would do. So not a lot of leadership coming. That's an aide in the White House, a senior aide in the White House, not sure what he would do when faced with a direct sort of foreign interference. Likewise, the president's private attorney, Rudy Giuliani, said a few weeks ago that there's no problem taking information from the Russians. So I do think there's this more first-order question of how do we make sure it actually is the norm in the country that foreign interference is bad. And here I would just echo the comments of my colleague from the last panel, Elaine. I think the campaigns can do a lot on this in terms of norm building and norm creation. So just one small idea, which actually for me comes from Germany, when a few years ago before their big elections, when Merkel was reelected, the main political parties got together and they had a little pact, and it said, okay, we're not going to, we're not going to accept foreign interference in our elections, no matter who's helped. We're not going to, we're not going to use dirty tricks against each other. And it basically worked in that election. So if you can just imagine for a second, all of these Democratic candidates, however many there
23.
are now. Yes, there you go. Signing, basically publicly saying, we're going to sign a pact and we're all going to get together in a room and we're going to sign it. It's going to say, if we get wind of any foreign interference in our campaign or any other campaign, we're going to tell each other about it. We're going to come up with best practices for making sure there isn't foreign money coming into our elections. We're going to all have the same rules about foreign nationals working in our campaigns. That would be a very powerful way, I think, to just reinforce these norms that actually having this foreign interference in our elections is a bad thing, not something we want going forward.
Okay, thank you. So, Mike, you have examined loan forgiveness for teachers as a way to address debt concerns as well as teacher pay issues. So, tell us about that idea and how it would help.
Happy to. Thank you, Daryl. And so, basically, the argument here is that this could be potentially a single solution for two problems that have been animating the electorate in recent years. A major problem, of course, is college affordability and access for many students. And then also within the past 18 months or so, we've seen a lot of teacher strikes, and that has really raised the visibility of low pay among teachers and teacher shortages. And so I would argue that a solution that would try to actually approach both of these issues, which is one that would offer much more significant, generous loan forgiveness for teachers, so that they basically have no loan payments as they are teaching, and actually most can become debt-free in, say, 5 to 8 years or 10 at most. Then this would be a program that could, in a way, at least partially attack two of these problems that have been big concerns among the electorate. So let's talk about why this would be very useful. First off, teaching is the largest public occupation in the United States, and so this is a very large swath of our college-educated workforce. We have all heard of, as I mentioned, these teacher strikes. They occurred in half dozen states last year. Continued unrest has also happened in another half dozen or so this year. And the issues that are animating these strikes are things like stagnant teacher pay, stagnant education funding since the Great Recession. What this means is that for many teachers, their take-home pay has actually been declining in real value, also coupled with increasing healthcare contributions or retirement contributions that are incurred to teachers now. And so their paychecks are actually shrinking in some of these places. There's also declining interest in the teaching profession as a whole. We see fewer college students going into education majors. This is a serious concern. And we are familiar with teacher shortages, at least headlines have shown teacher shortages across the country, particularly in certain subjects and in certain places. These are high need areas, whether those are in inner cities or whether they're out in the country. And they're also in particular subjects, including math, science, and special education. Also, if we are going to seriously expand early childhood programs across the country, as many are advocating, and many states have done in recent years, we also need to very seriously take the qualifications of the preschool teacher workforce into serious consideration, because that is seriously lagging behind the K-12 teacher workforce. So I think that's also an issue that we need to be concerned about. This is why I would argue that this is actually a politically viable approach. Number first, it is a very popular position among citizens. So survey responses have consistently said that the public believes that teachers should be paid more. Of course, the responses do change on whether the questioner, the respondent, knows what the teachers are actually paid, but it's still a consistent majority that support greater pay for teachers. Also, the fact that teachers are everywhere. There is not a single constituency that's obviously benefiting more or less, but they're all in red states, they're in blue states, they're in cities, they're in the country. This is something that many people, I would argue, could get behind. Also, doing a more generous loan forgiveness program could build on and replace existing loan forgiveness programs. We have some 3 federal programs and some 26 states that have current loan forgiveness programs. This can build on, use some of the resources that are already dedicated to this and then build on that. So this is, I would argue, this is not a far stretch. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge that what I would argue here, a more generous loan forgiveness program specifically for teachers, it's not going to go as far as some of the proposals, some of the big ticket proposals that we've heard of from some of the Democratic presidential candidates. So I'm thinking specifically of Kamala Harris's $13,000 raises for teacher proposal, or Sanders's proposal and his push for free college. Acknowledge that what I'm talking about is a much more modest approach. However, I would argue that this more modest approach could perhaps go a good distance of what either of those other approaches could do, but for a much lower cost. The argument here is by focusing on teachers and a public service occupation, it is these kinds of occupations that are actually the ones who need help with student debt problems the most. You know, those who are going into law or medical fields, perhaps they don't need that loan forgiveness nearly as much. Also, we can tweak some of the policies within a loan forgiveness program such that we are targeting specific high-need areas, specific high-need settings. And also, this is a particularly high leverage point to bring in, to help college students of color to join the teaching profession. And this is an area that where teachers of color are sorely needed, because we have strong evidence, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, that has come out that have connected teachers of color and matching between students and teachers of color to improve test scores, improve college graduation, improve behavioral outcomes, improve teacher expectations, college enrollment, a number of important student outcomes that I would argue that we're missing out on by having a teacher workforce that is currently 80% white compared to a student body that is more than 50% students of color. And finally, again, just to return to the point that if we really want to take early childhood education seriously, we also need to help think about seriously building up the pipeline for teachers to go into early childhood. And that's going to come out of college graduates, and that's only going to happen if we take seriously take into account the debt loads that many of these college students are taking on.
Thank you. Mayor Pete might want you to add mayors to this loan forgiveness program, because I was reading the other day, he and his husband have $130,000 in student debt. So all of you have sketched out important ideas. Makeda, you were talking about ways to protect consumers. What do you see as the most important implementation barrier to some of the ideas that you suggested, and how can we overcome those barriers?
I mean, I think simply put, there's a lot of ignorance from Congress to our prudential regulators around the shifts in the marketplace that, prevent us from making connections that really are sort of crucial. I listened to Mike's proposal, and I think about, workers are consumers, right? So when workers internalize the fear-mongering around automation and what that's going to do and how it's going to, make them irrelevant in the workplace, they still have families to feed and mortgages to pay. So they turn around and they become consumers. They reach out and go, think about refreshing their skills, taking on loans to get new degrees, new associates, new online programs. Most of these workers / consumers are, working. So they're going to try to turn to online programs. We've seen critical walkbacks at the CFPB in terms of protecting consumers from these predatory online colleges that have students racking up debt, and then in the end they have useless degrees, or certificates, or just debt in most cases. We need to figure out a much more coordinated response around how consumers interact with the financial marketplace across every spectrum of their life. And it's not just a purely financial thing. It matters to our democracy. I don't like speaking in terms of the Trump voter, but they exercised their right to choose another leader who heard their economic pains. they were excluded. And the more that we sort of continue around this path of not segregation, but like really, keeping ourselves clustered here or clustered in the Midwest and not understanding how we all interact and impact each other's lives, that really sort of goes to me to the heart of fixing whether it's consumer financial protection issues, our education, housing issues, and just speaks to general health of our democracy. Citizens need to be healthy to participate.
Okay. So John, you mentioned charter schools and the fact that the politics surrounding charter schools have shifted. What is the state of charter schools, and what reforms do you think are necessary?
Sure, it's a good question. So just a little bit of background. So charter schools are publicly funded, privately run schools, where essentially if you're operating a school, you have a contract with a government to run the school and live up to some outcomes that you promise. And they're public in the sense that they participate in state testing and all of those kinds of things, but they do have this autonomy that a lot of other schools don't. And on the politics side of charter schools, for a long time, the coalition that supported reforms like charter schools was this sort of delicately stitched together coalition that involved political conservatives who have always liked those types of reforms because they see a market side to that kind of reform, because parents choose a charter school. They don't get assigned to a charter school. It's had some appeal to civil rights groups because often they offer opportunities to choose schools that are only available to families who have enough money to either choose where they live or to pay for tuition at a private school. And then sort of a long time ago, when charters meant different things to different people, they had some appeal to unions to teachers' unions because they offered some potential for teachers to have more control over what happened in schools. And what we've seen, so there's been this coalition that sort of held this together. And what we've seen very recently, and by very recently I mean the last 2 or 3 years, is a real change in polling around charter schools. And essentially what it's been is a real dip in the Democratic Party for support for charter schools, and it's essentially just among white Democrats. So charters remain pretty popular among African American and Latino Democrats, but not popular among white Democrats, which has some consequences because it is disproportionately, it is students of color who attend charter schools. And so you have some I have some concerns that what we might be seeing there is some ideological concerns among white Democrats that could have real world tangible consequences for families who are in schools and may like at least certain features of them. So where that leaves us and kind of what I think that means policy-wise, there is something healthy to that skepticism, and what's healthy about it is that there is some messiness around charter school policy that needs to be cleaned up. So some of it is about transparency, and I mean we've seen over the last couple of years that a lot of charters aren't, so like open meetings laws don't apply, and some really sort of stunning basic things that relate to transparency. There also have been issues around something like closures. So there are schools around the country that will close kind of all of a sudden, and you have families who are in these schools who expected the school to be there, and they're sort of set off to try to find something and figure something else out. And there is work that can be done to sort of clean up those policies without taking away what can be sort of a last opportunity for families to choose schools. It can be done within the charter framework and just kind of working on charter policy. I think another way of doing it is to think about what it is within charter schools that have been positive and beneficial, and see if we can work that right into the framework of school districts. So for example, in my view, one benefit of that type of program is it weakens the link between where kids live and which schools they attend, which just sort of opens up access to schools that students otherwise might not have access to. That can happen within a district setting too. So we could have much more choice within school districts so you don't reproduce residential segregation in every kind of traditionally zoned public school. That is an option that's available to us. So if the education world down the road if charter schools are not part of that world, we should give some thought to, there are some things that progressives like too, that charter schools have been doing, and we can find ways of building that into newer models for school district governance.
Margaret, I have Two questions for you. One, you mentioned your daughter taking this digital literacy class. I'm just curious, how do they teach, and what is it they teach, and what seems to be working? And then the second part is just, you mentioned the infrastructure challenges and the different responsibilities of federal, state, and local governments. What should each of those levels be doing to secure American elections?
So on the digital literacy, I was really impressed because she came home and was talking about it and sort of describing it. And it seemed pretty comprehensive, like, and it's very hands-on, right? So the teacher would give them, okay, like this is the claim from this website. Like, go and research. It's very hands-on, which I think is key. Anyone who has kids out there, they're using computers all the time in the classrooms. It's a part of their world. It's a pretty immersive, I'd say, education for these kids in her school about how to manage their digital world. The particular school my daughter goes to, they don't shut down. There are some schools out there that sort of prohibit what types of sites students can visit when they're on the campus and using computers there. My daughter's school does not, because their philosophy is they're going to have to live in the world. So we're going to give them an opportunity to live in the world in a controlled space where they can figure out how to deal with it. So that's kind of the main thing I was sort of impressed with, is that they're not shielding these kids from realities of things that are on the internet. They're teaching them skills for how to deal with them, which is the reality of what their lives are going to be about. Infrastructure challenges, I will totally admit I am not an expert on that topic. I am like a foreign policy and national security person. That's sort of what I've done my entire career. What's interesting to me about this space of foreign interference is that it's sort of, to me, it's sort of the foreign policy and national security world sort of colliding almost with these domestic type issues. And I think that's sort of, at least for me, that has been sort of a new collision of the sort of international and the foreign policy colliding with the domestic. And so this is an area that I've been sort of digging into and wanting to talk more with some of my colleagues who are experts. But it is a major challenge due to the way our government is constructed. So Finland, Sweden, Denmark, smaller countries, there's one education system, essentially. There's one set of laws that would for most of these countries that would govern their election infrastructure. For us, we've got state, local, city. We've got everything. We've got the distrust that there is among some of the states and the federal government. So there's limits in some ways to what the federal government can do. The main thing I would maybe draw attention to is something that Elaine spoke about in the first panel, which is, or related, the people interfering, foreigners or whoever interfering in elections, they only have to be successful in a very small number of counties in order to swing an entire presidential election. And so for me, I guess what I would say is, let's figure out what those counties are, and it is known in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that will swing a presidential election. Let's go to those counties and make sure that the protections are there, and that they're getting everything they need in order to really protect, in particular for 2020. So going to really where the fight is in some respects in these contested counties that are going to decide the election and make sure they have what they need.
Okay, so I have a final question for Mike, then we'll open the floor to questions from you. So you mentioned loan forgiveness programs. What do you see as the biggest barriers to action in this area, and how can we overcome those obstacles?
Barriers to action here. I'm not entirely sure where the barriers to action are. I would probably, just sort of shooting from the hip, say that it doesn't feel as though there's a general recognition that teachers do need some help, because as evidenced by the 26 or so states that actually have loan forgiveness programs already in place. So there is an acknowledgement that we do have vacancies that are worth dealing with. I would guess and surmise that the largest barriers that we have are related to cost, because of these loan forgiveness programs that we do offer, many of them are actually not that generous. I would argue that a benefit on the range of $2,000 to $5,000 per year of teaching that you're doing, and capping the benefit at 4 years of teaching. So for a total benefit of somewhere anywhere between $8,000 to about $12,000 or maybe $15,000 for most of these programs. I would argue that's not a particularly generous program, and particularly when we're looking at the benefits of it. Well, I think I would argue that there is a real value that's often, or a calculation that's often missing from looking at just the dollars of that program versus the dollars of spending more money on teacher salaries, which is, by spending more money on teacher salaries, we're also paying money into a lot of overhead costs that go, things like retirement and benefits that we can actually avoid by simply forgiving the loans of teachers and just offering more loan forgiveness for them. And of course, not everybody is going to fully utilize the entire benefit that is offered. And particularly students who are students of color, as I was mentioning, or college graduates of color, they come out with more of a loan debt balance. And so if we were to offer the more generous the program becomes, the larger, in theory, the larger of a pull that it's going to have in for that group into the teaching profession, which I would argue is really necessary for these low-income student groups and groups of color.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. There's a question right here in the front row. There's a microphone coming up to you. So if you can give us your name and organization.
John Cummings, unaffiliated. Just on the student loan, people that get college educations do better than those that don't. Recent data shows $30,000 to $40,000 a year better. Why do we want to subsidize those that are already going to be doing well? Isn't education just an investment in self? And so you make that investment, and then you're going to do better in the long run.
That's a great question, and that question is actually behind a lot of the resistance to the larger free college programs in general, which is, if most of the people who are going to college are benefiting quite handsomely from going to college, and the debt, taking on that debt, is still worth it, then why do we need to subsidize them? And that's a great question, but I would argue that doesn't apply to every single occupation, and particularly for some occupations, that calculus may not necessarily fall through the way that it's the ROI is positive here. And so this is why I would argue for a more targeted, occupation-specific type of benefit. And here I would say this public sector, teaching, which is very much in the public sector and the public service, and it's also one where we've seen declining investment in states to help support teacher salaries over time. Of course, not every state, but many states. And so I would say that this is an area that feels like it would give us a lot of bang for our buck in investing in basically helping to defray some of the costs of college.
Can I jump in on that? So I think that's a very good question. I think this is right at the heart of what, in my view, is actually the most important education issue in the Democratic presidential debate right now, which is, what do we do about college costs? And this is outside of my world a little bit. I do more K-12 than anything else, but candidates right now are proposing really big ideas in higher education. And some are proposing free community college, some are proposing free college in general, and some are focusing kind of on loan forgiveness. Those have really different consequences, and there are sort of different values that they would advance. And so if you're thinking about loan forgiveness programs, one of the concerns about a loan forgiveness program is that those graduates, or whoever it is who's sort of accrued that debt, they've already gone through college. So a loan forgiveness program is not going to get more people back into college. Mm-hmm. And it's often, the biggest debt is often held by people who are doing relatively well. If you start talking about free community college and some of the other proposals that are out there, those would maybe be a better way of targeting some of those resources to more disadvantaged communities, and to create incentives for more people to go to college, because they're looking at a very different price tag from the one they might be looking at now. So I think this is sort of at the heart of what is probably the most important issue on the education side in the Democratic presidential debates right now.
There's a gentleman next to the window who has a question. If we can get there's a microphone coming up behind you.
I'm Jack Underhill. I retired 22 years ago after 41 years of federal service. My question relates to charter schools, and a lot of press indicated that the New Orleans schools, charter schools, have been phenomenally successful. On the other hand, there was some cherry picking, at least early, and a lot of low-income people moved out of New Orleans. So, and the Credo study shows in general, nationally, the second round of Credo study shows that charter schools have been doing reasonably well compared to public schools, particularly with regard to minorities.
It's a good question, and a lot of my work is actually in New Orleans. I spent a couple of years in New Orleans trying to understand that school system. I'll tell you my perspective, and it's really polarizing what has happened in New Orleans. So big picture, kind of stepping back, New Orleans has an unusual school system. It's different from every other school system in the country. Kids are not assigned to a school based on where they live at all. So every family in New Orleans has to request schools, and then there's an algorithm that will place kids in schools based on families' requests and the seat availability in schools and some kind of placement priorities. So you have this really decentralized, really choice-heavy education system that went into place right after Hurricane Katrina, when they were sort of picking up, trying to figure out what to do with the school system. My view of the New Orleans education reforms, if you look at outcomes, the outcomes are quite positive. So student performance on tests is much higher than it was before the storm. And then there's sort of more careful ways of doing those kinds of comparisons for reasons like the one you mentioned, that a lot of families did leave those schools. But in sort of the best studies we have that compare students in New Orleans to students in other hurricane-affected districts and those types of things, the outcomes look really good. So there is a sort of outcome and policy side that looks quite positive. There's a process side to how those reforms came about that really bothers a lot of people, and I think still bothers a lot of people today. So what happened in New Orleans was after Hurricane Katrina, the state essentially grabbed control of the schools and told the residents of New Orleans what the school system was going to be, which bothers people when it feels like they are no longer being trusted to govern themselves. And there were lots of voices that were locked out in New Orleans. There are lots of people who I think would be running probably better schools than the schools we have now, who never were given that opportunity because there was sort of too much attention on bringing in outside operators. So my view is the process was never good. It maybe has gotten a little bit better over time. The outcomes are good enough to pay attention to and to not dismiss, because there may be something in that model that is actually benefiting students.
Other questions? Question. We have two questions right here. We'll take each of you.
Abraham Zhao, Hudson Institute. I had two questions, one for Dr. Makeda and one for the other panelists. For Dr. Makeda, you talked about a lot of the financial protections that consumers might need in the upcoming 21st century. I was wondering about privacy protections as well. There's this skit I've seen online that essentially goes, well, from the corporation side, if you don't want to use our products and have us collect your data, you don't have to. And then the argument back was, yeah, we kind of do have to use your products in this day and age. It's unreasonable not to have a cell phone and go to work in DC. So yeah, just thinking about what policy goals we can achieve in terms of privacy protections on the consumer side. And for the rest of the panelists, I was wondering about digitalization of education. Just because it's not something that was talked about much. I have sentimental reasons. I don't really like it, but I was wondering why that might not be an alternative policy goal that you guys want to pursue. Thank you.
Great. So I'm glad that you asked that question on data privacy. I think it's a really critical area and kind of goes to my earlier comments. GAO put out a report earlier this year looking at how FTC and CFPB both sort of take on critical issues. On the one hand, they sort of cut the report in half and talk about where FTC has done its enforcement actions and what those weaknesses are. And they've really sort of sparked an opportunity or identified an opportunity in dusting off the Grime-Leach-Bliley Act and saying, more can be done here to strengthen the FTC's positioning in the marketplace and really send messages. So, for example, I believe FTC is sort of hampered in how it can penalize companies. So they sort of have to wait after an initial event has happened. But we know from Equifax, all you need to do is have just one event, and it is a colossal impact. But consumers are hamstrung in being able to respond. So on the CFPB side, you could go and complain. But you can't say, I don't want Equifax to ever handle my consumer data ever again because they've been so irresponsible, and take it and sort of only leave it with Experian and TransUnion. That's not possible. So I go back to thinking that the way forward here really looks at how we can harmonize sort of disparate state of play when it comes to protecting consumers, because data is so central now, right? It's no longer about figuring out how many underwriters thought that loan officers didn't like black applicants and therefore priced their loans higher or didn't give them credit. It's a much more subtle process. And so we really need to think much more carefully about how we put together a consumer financial protection framework that covers all, whether it's education or how we fund our education, to how we fund our homes and retirement. And I think Elizabeth Warren has always been a champion. She's so energetic. She's the reason why we have Dodd-Frank and CFPB today. I would really like to see her lend some of that energy to reframe the conversation from this tension between Main Street and Wall Street, and really sort of advance some really thoughtful policies about what does it mean to be a consumer in the 21st century, and how much machine learning algorithms and this data privacy tension exposes us to numerous harms that our regulations today aren't necessarily up to snuff in terms of they're not robust enough to protect those kinds of dangers.
So John and/or Mike, the digitization of education. Good idea?
Well, I'll quickly hop in and say that digitization in education, at least I'll speak of K-12 education because that's my main area of focus. There have been a number of studies that have looked at it in every which way, and many of these come out with very mixed results. And so I would say there's not a very strong consensus that digitizing education is in and of itself necessarily an advancement. However, I would say that what many of these studies point to actually is that that digitization alone is not sufficient, but rather digitization, when accompanied with really good teacher practices and teacher instruction on the other side. So it's an argument that we should be doing this in a symbiotic fashion, where we're really focusing on both teacher quality and teacher instruction and the digitization side of things, so that it's actually moving forward rather than just simply a blanket rollout of digitization, because arguably that's not necessarily going to get us anywhere further.
John, any thoughts on that?
I agree, and I would just add that a lot of the reason we send kids to school involves personal interaction. It's personal interaction with teachers,
Yes.
with counselors, with students, and so at its best, what this is it's ways of delivering more personalized instruction kind of around the edges, but the core of teaching and learning is, in my view, too personal for that to entirely displace the sort of core way that schools look today.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We'll give it to you. And there's a microphone coming over to you.
Thank you. It's Hans Kolber from Open Dreams Organization. This question is for Margaret. Margaret, you had mentioned that there's some older voters in the 65, 80-year-old block that are vulnerable to attacks and subject to manipulation on online news sources. While it's a very good move for there to be a lot more digital literacy and education with the younger generation, with elementary school, unfortunately, they can't vote in our system yet. But while the older voters do constitute a very large majority of our electorate, have there been moves to really, in studies, to really identify those groups that are most vulnerable to attacks and subject to manipulation? And then secondly, have there been actual programs or processes to try to educate all citizens, but especially those most vulnerable?
So I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't know the answer to your question. I haven't heard of any studies. I think there are studies on the consumer, like the vulnerability of consumers, like older population on the consumer scene. But on the digitization thing, I guess I would see the digital sort of like online training about these issues might be the most useful for that older population that's not going to be in a school somewhere. There's not going to be an opportunity necessarily to sort of insert. So maybe that's a space for the AARP. Maybe the AARP is already on this. Looking at ways to create online courses that can be offered to their constituency. So no, I don't know that studies have been done. It's more I've just sort of observed it as I've been doing some research on this topic, and that seems to me like a cohort of voters that isn't getting enough attention in digital competency.
Makeda, do you want to talk about financial literacy as a possible parallel to digital literacy?
As you were talking earlier about it, it did pop into my mind. The evidence on financial literacy it's pretty weak in terms of how effective at least the models that we've used thus far has been in achieving any meaningful results. And so maybe it is that it failed in the financial literacy arena, but it might do better here because the lessons between how you should do X and then seeing X happen, that space is much shorter. So, you can go to classes and learn how to save, but it surely takes a long time to get to $1,000. But, I'm just thinking of myself as a lay consumer, on Facebook, I really worry these days about, am I intelligent enough to sort of figure out and distinguish between fake news on my Facebook feed versus a deep fake or a credible news source? And I sure wish Facebook would do something to some kind of education program to kind of teach consumers like myself how to make these distinctions. I was pretty shocked that a video that I think I might have seen was on NPR they were sort of talking about an NPR that talked about how much this video looked real, the facts were nice and polished about, I think it was nutrition or some of the health news, and it turned out to be, just pure fodder. And I was taken aback. It really kind of shocked me. But sort of taking from that example or idea, I think maybe we might find another way to take all that we've learned and invested in financial literacy and reapply it in a digital sense, because the space between teach and action and outcome is so much smaller.
Maybe we all need it. That's probably the answer. We all need it.
Well, as the most senior citizen on this panel, I don't see organizations really focusing on my age group. And I think you're right. This is the age group that actually needs it, both because they are lacking in that area and they are the group that's going to vote in the greatest numbers.
We all need it, Daryl. Yeah. We all need it.
We're out of time, but I want to thank our panelists, Makeda, John, Margaret, and Mike. Really appreciate your sharing your views. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.